So Asian luxuries thereby became commodities, and by becoming commodities would eventually become necessities of the European palate. So this transition from preciosity to necessity, they become everyday goods. Let's consider an example that Valeria takes for granted every time you get out your pepper grinder to spice things up. Pepper. Pepper and world history. There are a lot of different kinds of pepper. What we use now is a pepper from a berry that is harvested green and then left to ferment to allow the skin to flake off, and then the insides could darken and shrivel. And so when we think of a peppercorn, that's in fact what it is. And it's crucial for the masalas in India and grilled meats in the Arab world. Romans loved their pepper. So how is pepper related to world history? Let's roll back to the 1490s and go back to a character called Vasco da Gama. He made a very brief appearance in an earlier lecture. And the ways in which Vasco da Gama extended the Portuguese exploration down the littoral coast of Africa, especially from the 1480s, participating in the ways in which Europeans were exploring the coasts of Africa, lured ever westward and southward in pursuit of African gold. Vasco da Gama. He was part of this effort on the part of Europeans to explore the coast of Africa and would eventually be the first to skirt the southern tip. Why, of course, were the Europeans moving their way down the Atlantic Ocean? Well, to avoid the Muslim blockade of North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. And they finally found a way, thanks to da Gama, to circle the Cape of Good Hope in 1497 and slip in to the Indian Ocean that we just discussed. Actually, this little point right here, called the Cape of Good Hope, was originally called the Cape of Storms. This was a treacherous passage. And it was rebaptized the Cape of Good Hope to make it sound more auspicious, a little bit like the ways in which debtor countries of the so-called Third World were rebaptized emerging markets by financiers in the 1980s, or perhaps what we now call stimulus as we discuss European and world economic recovery. Either way, by the 1490s, the relationship between exploration and trade were completely entwined. So was, in fact, religion. For the King of Portugal had died in 1496. His successor, a man called Dom Manuel I, was, like Isabel and Ferdinand, the Catholic monarchs of a newborn Spain, a fervent believer that there was something redemptive in what Iberians were doing in their explorations, and imagined himself as the last world emperor, fighting a crusade against the Antichrist. Manuel was prone to the same kinds of fantasies that Isabel had when she dreamed of Columbus producing the riches that would allow her to wage the last crusade to liberate Jerusalem. For Manuel, Vasco da Gama was the chosen vector. Da Gama's origins are obscure, but this new actor burst into the Indian Ocean scene. And from the start, da Gama played by his own rules. When he got to Mozambique, right here, he asked for supplies, but he had nothing to offer. So he attacked the merchant ships, the Arab merchant ships that contained supplies that would nourish his crew. 2 months later, he entered Mombasa and got into a shootout. Then to Malindi and did the same thing. The ruler of Malindi sent an envoy to negotiate with the Portuguese navigator, and da Gama took him hostage. What did da Gama want as he made his way up the east coast of Africa? Well, one of the things he needed was help sailing to India. By then, he had figured out that he had penetrated into the Indian Ocean, that otherwise Europeans had to cross over, but they no longer could thanks to the Muslim blockade. He discovered that he had found a way to get in a sense, through the back door. One of the things he was after was pepper. Up and down the west coast of Africa, adventurers had relied on African and Arab navigational knowledge to figure out the waters of the system. And as da Gama moved in to the Indian Ocean, he realized that he needed some local expertise to help him figure out how he was going to get into the rest of the trading system. In fact, he continues this practice that Europeans had used in the Atlantic Ocean. But he had nothing to offer. He had, therefore, to rely on his brute strength. And he eventually got what he needed: a pilot, somebody to lead him around the Indian Ocean. The pilot was a mysterious figure, a legendary figure. Some have called him a Christian, others a Muslim, others a Gujarati. Some remember his name was Molemo Kana, others Molemo Kanakwa, a variation on the Swahili word for pilot. Others call him Ahmad Ibn Majid. He played, and I've mentioned this before and I will keep reiterating it, an important role as a broker in this system, relying on local indigenous knowledge to enable Europeans to expand, akin to Doña Marina in Mexico for Cortés. The role of brokers and intermediaries is very important for understanding these processes. It took da Gama 23 days to cross the Indian Ocean. And on May 1498, imagine what the 1490s was doing to world history, he entered the port of Calicut, one of these entrepot cities that I talked about earlier, a Malabar emporium. He enters the harbor, 3 very beaten up vessels, relatively small by the standards of the day, but different in some very fundamental ways to the other vessels that the merchants and the mariners of Calicut would have been familiar with. These were heavy vessels, rounded plank hulls, very high superstructures, 3-masted and square-rigged. They also came with small square windows, out of which protruded cannon. Well, the Indians had cannon too, but they seldom used them on their vessels. They tended to use them on the fortifications on the mainland to protect their ports. So when da Gama enters Calicut, what he wanted was something lucrative. This adventure had to pay off. And so there ensued a complicated negotiation. By now, da Gama knew, that the famed port of Calicut was a great pepper entrepot. That's what he was seeking. Now, da Gama, in his negotiations with the king Samorim, could not have been more inappropriate. Here you have an image of da Gama meeting the king. He could not be more inappropriate or offensive. He confused Hinduism with a local form of Christianity. And when he finally got an audience with King Samorim, all he had to offer were some hats, metal cookware, some old coats, ewers, butter, some honey, and a little bit of coral. This was not much for a great king, and the courtiers literally laughed at him. And this was deeply humiliating for da Gama. For if these were meant as token gestures, they were demeaning for the king. As trade goods, they were worthless. The negotiations that ensued took 3 full months, and in the end, da Gama's agents forged a contract, at the end of which, as they were sailing out, they refused to pay the customary exit tax. And as they tried to slip out of the harbor secretly, they took themselves 4 hostages from Calicut, just in case they would be pursued. Much to the relief of Calicut, Mombasa, Kilwa, Malindi, the other ports that da Gama had entered, they were glad to be rid of this impoverished Portuguese bully. But they would pay a price. Because he lacked a pilot, in pulling out of Calicut, he'd not taken with him a pilot, da Gama would pay a price. He headed straight into the monsoons. Many of his sailors were lost, 2 ships gone. Swept around by currents and winds he did not understand without relying on local knowledge. And when he finally slinked back into Lisbon, only 2 of the final vessels survived. The cargo of spices was relatively modest by the end, but it paid for the entire expedition and still yielded a profit. This cargo of pepper would issue a riptide of news through Europe. Venetian houses that traded in pepper went into a panic. Their pepper prices threatened to plunge. In fact, one might speculate on how much the arrival of a new source of spices created the conditions for the long-term decline of the Venetian economy, especially once Europeans were able to move around the African coast. Venice no longer enjoyed that special strategic location in the Mediterranean. Alexandrian Arab merchants also worried that they'd been literally circumnavigated. Europeans were now able to trade directly with the Indian Ocean. So not unlike the effects of the discovery of the New World, here we see the new ways in which the oldest worlds were being shaken up. For the scramble of merchants and opportunists now to get into this action. The beginnings, after 1500, of centuries of commercial warfare in the Indian Ocean and the China Seas. So as we pause, we might consider how da Gama's entry into the Indian Ocean might compare with earlier patterns of cross-cultural contact.